Live updates on Russia-Ukraine. Zelenskyy and Biden meet in Lithuania. As Russia continued to occupy neighboring Ukraine for nearly 16 months, political unrest erupted in Moscow as Kyiv sought to gain territory. The argument between Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group, and senior Russian soldiers escalated when Prigozhin's troops left the Ukrainian front and crossed the border to capture an important Russian city. They then proceeded north of the Russian capital, seemingly unopposed, before returning a few hours later. International observers described the brief uprising as the most important challenge to Russian President Vladimir Putin's authority in more than 2 decades. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, are in the early stages of a counteroffensive to retake about a fifth of Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and U.S. President Joe Biden are currently in the Lithuanian capital for a face-to-face meeting. Zelenskyy announced on Twitter Wednesday night that bilateral talks in Vilnius have started. This is the third face-to-face meeting of the leaders of the two countries this year. "We're focused on security and anything that improves security," Zelenskyy tweeted. "It would make sense." We met with the President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelenskyy at the NATO summit in Lithuania. The meeting came after Biden recently voiced doubts about Ukraine's long-term goal of joining the transatlantic alliance. "During the war, I don't think there is a consensus in NATO right now on whether Ukraine should be included in the NATO family," he told CNN last week. "If the war continues, we are all in the war," he said. "If that's the case, we are at war with Russia." The president also said that Ukraine needs democratic reforms before joining the Union. At a news conference in Vilnius on Monday, NATO President Jens Stoltenberg said it was important for NATO members to send a united and strong statement on Ukraine's ability to join the alliance. He reiterated Russia's long-standing warnings about Ukraine joining NATO. "You know the same thing about the Russian Federation, and the fact that Ukraine's entry into NATO will have a negative impact on the security architecture in Europe, which is half destroyed," he said, according to The Observer. "A real danger, a threat to our country, requires a clear and definitive answer from us." Presidents Biden and Zelenskyy last met at the G7 summit in Japan in May. The talks will likely focus on U.S. aid to Ukraine and the wider NATO leaders, the president of Ukraine in the Lithuanian capital. He met with Volodymyr Zelenskyy on Wednesday. The defense of Ukraine concluded their meeting by emphasizing support for Russian aggression and discussing the future of Ukraine in cooperation. Speaking at a press conference with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, Zelenskyy said that he understands that some allies do not want to consider Ukraine's participation at the moment for fear of world war, and it is clear that Ukraine will be able to participate in joint cooperation with Russia during the ongoing conflict. When allies agree and the conditions are met, NATO will be able to extend its invitation to Ukraine to join the coalition, NATO leaders said on Tuesday, reiterating Ukraine's role in supporting coalition members, without any promises or delays that Zelenskyy sought. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the United States has given more than $76 billion in aid to the countries of the East, of which more than $46 billion is military. The most controversial was the United States' announcement earlier this month that it would begin sending missiles to incarcerated countries as part of an $800 million aid package. This type of weapon, which launches in the air and throws small bombs over a wide area, has been criticized for inflicting harm on a large number of people. Exploded bombs can remain unexploded for years, increasing the risk of death for non-combatants. This move to deploy these weapons was criticized by America's allies. The Canadian government said last week, "Canada is bound by the Constitution and is fulfilling our obligations under the organization, and we support its international acceptance." British Foreign Secretary Rishi Sunak also spoke of Britain's rejection of cluster bombs, although he acknowledged that the US had to make its own hard decisions, that it would not help Ukraine. The UK has signed an agreement banning the manufacture or use of ballistic missiles and barring their use, he told reporters last week. "We will continue to do our work to support Ukraine against illegal and unconstitutional Russian aggression, but we have done this by providing large combat vehicles and knives, long weapons, and we hope all countries will continue to support Ukraine." The United States has not used ballistic missiles since the Iraq War in the early 2000s. And more than 120 countries have joined the international treaty banning the use of ballistic missiles. But Ukrainian officials, including Ukrainian presidential spokesman Mikhailo Podolyak, welcomed the development. "In this bloody war that has been going on for 16 months and will determine the future of the world, weapons are important. So guns, more guns, including explosives," he said last week. U.S. National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan said the White House had argued that it had received documentary evidence that Ukraine would use the bombs as a precautionary measure to reduce the risk to the public. Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov said last week that Russia will comply with human rights law, noting that Russia is already using missiles against Ukrainian civilians. "I would like to say that we will strictly abide by all international humanitarian aid agreements signed and ratified by Ukraine, while exercising the indispensable right of self-defense." The issue of ammunition was at the center of the war in Ukraine. According to the White House, supplies of ammunition are limited at home and abroad to provide firepower against Russia. "The Ukrainians are running out of bullets," Biden told CNN. "It's a war about bullets. They're running out of bullets and we're running out of bullets." Such considerations will be important as Ukraine continues its protests that began last month. Zelenskyy admitted that the protests were slower than expected. The war in Ukraine is not the only important topic of discussion at the conference. Unification was promised at the end of the conference, but preliminary preparations created friction in Europe's bloodiest war in generations. Biden praised Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians for their bravery, calling him an example for the whole world to see. Zelenskyy thanked Biden and the American people for billions of dollars in military aid and said, "You are spending this money on our lives." Wearing a blue-yellow-white striped shirt in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, Biden admitted that he was sometimes dissatisfied with Zelenskyy's demands not to buy weapons. "I can only imagine the disappointment," Biden said. "I know you're often frustrated with what comes to you fast enough, what you have, and how we got it. But I can assure you that America is doing everything it can to give you what you want." Biden also said at the conference that war creates peace against international terrorism. They sat together at the first meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council, a new forum aimed at giving Kyiv a greater say in the alliance. They came together when the Group of Seven, the world's most powerful democracies, jointly announced plans to provide long-term security assistance to Ukraine. Wednesday afternoon, however, was the first opportunity for Biden and Zelensky to have a one-on-one meeting with their advisors after making public statements. At that time, Zelensky sold his voice very loudly. On his way to Vilnius on Tuesday, he blew up NATO's vague plans for Ukraine's eventual NATO membership and tweeted, "There is no timetable for invitations or calendars for Ukraine to join. This is unprecedented and bad." Biden's national security advisor, Joe Sullivan, said everyone must face the facts because allowing Ukraine to join NATO means war with Russia. He praised Biden for making NATO more integrated, more stable, and more determined than ever before. "I'm glad," he said. "It's moving in the right direction but not fast enough when it comes to supporting Ukraine quickly." Arms transfers never seem to happen right after the announcement, said McConnell, a Kentucky Republican, adding that Ukrainians were very grateful for the help but usually not early enough. Make the best effective effect.